The train from Butte, Montana pulled into the station at Missoula on the morning of November 14, 1902, carrying 43 passengers and one ghost. Arthur Grayson stepped onto the platform wearing clothes that no longer fit him. The wool coat hung from shoulders that had narrowed, the collar loose around a neck gone thin. He was 29 years old. The stationmaster who greeted him later told his wife that Grayson's eyes had the quality of windows in an abandoned house, something looking out that was no longer meant for seeing. He carried no luggage. When asked about the others, he said nothing. The others were 6 men. They had entered the Rattlesnake Wilderness on September 2nd with provisions for 3 weeks, hired by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company to survey potential claims in the high country. The company expected them back by September 25th. When October came and went, search parties were dispatched. They found the base camp intact, supplies mostly accounted for, and no trace of 7 men. Arthur Grayson walked out of those mountains on November 9th, alone. The company officials met him at a boarding house on Front Street. They brought a stenographer. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. According to the clerk who prepared the room, Grayson sat in the chair they offered him, accepted the glass of water, and when asked to describe what had happened, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. The stenographer's notebook from that day contains the questions asked, 23 of them, increasingly specific, increasingly desperate. Where the answers should be, she had drawn a single line down the page. At the bottom, in different ink, someone had written, "Subject declined to respond to all inquiries." His younger sister, Claire, traveled from Helena to bring him home. She told the company superintendent that Arthur had always been the talkative one in the family, the one who filled Sunday dinners with stories from whatever mine or timber camp he'd been working. She said when she embraced him at the boarding house, his body went rigid as lumber. The ride back to Helena took 6 hours. She tried 3 times to ask him what happened. The third time, according to her diary, later donated to the Montana Historical Society, he turned to look at her, and she saw something in his face that made her stop mid-sentence. "It was not anger," she wrote. "It was not fear. It was a kind of decision already made that I was not to question again." She never did. The families of the other 6 men were less accommodating. They wanted answers. They deserved them. William Pritchard had left behind a wife and 3 children under the age of 7. James Whitmore was engaged to be married in December. Thomas Chen had been sending money back to his family in San Francisco every month without fail. Carl Bergstrom, Samuel Red Morrison, and Daniel Hopewell each had people waiting. Arthur Grayson would not speak about any of them. The Anaconda Company, facing potential lawsuits and public pressure, commissioned a formal inquiry. A retired federal marshal named Hugh Dalton was brought in to conduct interviews. His report, filed in March of 1903, runs to 47 pages. 46 of them are devoted to statements from witnesses, family members, fellow miners, townspeople, and the search parties who combed the mountains that October. Page 47 is Arthur Grayson's testimony. It is blank except for a single notarized statement. Arthur James Grayson appeared before this inquiry on March 8, 1903. When asked to give testimony regarding the events of September-November 1902, he respectfully declined. When pressed, he declined again. When threatened with legal action, he stated only, "I will not speak of it." This remained his position throughout 3 hours of questioning. Marshal Dalton added a handwritten note in the margin. Subject appeared to be of sound mind and body. Refusal seems conscious and absolute. Recommend closure of inquiry for lack of evidence. The families appealed. They wrote letters to the governor, to the mining company, to newspapers. The Helena Independent ran a front-page story with the headline, "What does he know? Sole survivor refuses to break silence." The piece included a photograph of Grayson walking down State Street, head down, hat pulled low. The photographer who took it said Grayson never acknowledged the camera, never looked up, moved through the crowd like a man underwater. Public sentiment turned. Some said he was protecting the company, that there had been an industrial accident and he'd been paid to keep quiet. Others whispered darker things, that he had done something to the others, that his silence was guilt. A third group, smaller but persistent, suggested he had simply gone mad from whatever he'd endured. That trauma had locked his tongue. Arthur Grayson heard all of it and said nothing. He took a job at the assay office on Broadway, work that required precision and silence. He lived in a rented room above a tailor's shop. He attended church irregularly. He did not drink in public houses, did not join fraternal organizations, did not court women. His sister visited every Sunday. They would sit together in his room or walk the streets of Helena, and she learned to fill the silence with her own talk, the news of cousins and neighbors, small things that required no response. In 1904, Margaret Pritchard, widow of William, confronted him outside the assay office. 3 witnesses recorded the encounter. She had brought her oldest child, a boy of 9, and she asked Grayson to look at the child and tell her what had happened to his father. Grayson looked at the boy. The witnesses agreed on this detail. He looked for a long time, and something moved in his face, something almost like speech forming. Then he turned and walked back into the office and closed the door. Margaret Pritchard stood outside for 20 minutes before her son led her away. The question that haunted those who encountered Arthur Grayson was not whether he knew what happened. Everyone agreed he knew. The question was why he would not say. What could be worse than the not knowing he had condemned these families to endure? What truth could be so unbearable that silence was the more merciful choice? These questions assumed his silence was for himself, a protection of his own conscience or sanity. No one considered that it might be for them. The 7 men who entered the Rattlesnake Wilderness in September of 1902 were not strangers to each other, nor to the work. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company had assembled the survey team carefully. They needed men who could handle high elevation, difficult terrain, and their own company for weeks at a time. The territory they were mapping lay 40 miles northeast of Missoula, accessible only on foot or horseback, in mountains that had defeated previous survey attempts due to weather and topography. William Pritchard was the crew chief. At 34, he had worked for Anaconda for 11 years, starting as a powder monkey and working his way up to shift supervisor. Company records describe him as reliable, level-headed, experienced in wilderness operation. His personnel file contains 3 commendations for safety and 1 for pulling 2 men from a collapsed drift. He had been married 9 years and wrote letters home twice weekly when working remote sites. His wife saved everyone. They are preserved in the Montana archives, neat stacks tied with string, full of ordinary affection and plans for a future that would not arrive. Thomas Chen served as the team's geological assistant and translator. He was 26, educated at the Colorado School of Mines, fluent in Cantonese, English, and passable German. The transcripts of interviews with his colleagues describe a man of precision and quiet humor, someone who could diffuse tension in a crew with a well-timed observation. He kept detailed field notebooks. 3 were recovered from the base camp, meticulously illustrated with mineral samples and stratigraphic diagrams. The 4th notebook, the one he would have been carrying, was never found. Carl Bergstrom was the senior surveyor, a Swede who had worked railroad grades across Montana and Idaho before joining Anaconda. He was 41, unmarried, methodical. His former supervisor at Northern Pacific described him as the most precise transit man I have known, would measure twice where others measured once. He had surveyed in the Bitterroots, the Missions, the Sapphires. The Rattlesnake Range was considered routine for a man of his experience. Samuel Red Morrison handled camp logistics and packing. He was 32, called Red for the color of his hair and the temper that supposedly came with it, though multiple sources describe him as even-tempered and generous. He had worked as a packer for geological surveys throughout the Northwest and had a reputation for being able to get men and equipment through country that defeated others. A fellow packer who worked with him on the 1899 Flathead survey said Morrison could read weather and terrain like some men read newspapers and was as close to infallible as any man in the mountains could be. James Whitmore was the youngest at 23, hired as a chainman and general assistant. His fiancée, Caroline Dennison, kept a diary throughout their courtship. Portions were published in the Montana Standard in 1903 as part of the newspaper's coverage of the disappearance. She described him as full of enthusiasm for the work, eager to prove himself, perhaps too eager. His last letter to her, dated August 28th and postmarked from Missoula, expressed excitement about the survey. "Mr. Pritchard says this could lead to permanent position if I do well. The country we're headed into is supposed to be remarkable. I will bring you stones from the peaks, dearest." Daniel Hopewell was the expedition medic and cook, a practical arrangement for small crews. He was 38, trained as a field surgeon during the Spanish-American War, haunted by it enough that he preferred remote mining camps to cities. A doctor who had worked with him at the Butte hospital said Hopewell was capable but withdrawn, drank too much when idle, was better when given purpose and isolation. The survey would provide both. And then Arthur Grayson, assistant surveyor, 29 years old. The company files on Grayson before the expedition are unremarkable. He had worked for Anaconda since 1897, mostly surface surveys and claim verification. His supervisors rated him competent, steady, not given to complaint. He had some education, 2 years at the Montana School of Mines, and enough field experience to be trusted with instruments. He had worked 3 previous surveys with William Pritchard and 1 with Carl Bergstrom. The evaluations describe him as quiet but not withdrawn, follows instruction, adequate mathematically, good in difficult weather. Those who knew him socially paint a similar picture. His sister Claire described him as thoughtful, enjoyed reading, liked to work with his hands, was good with children. A boarding house owner where he had stayed during work in Anaconda remembered him as polite, paid on time, sometimes played cards in the evening with other boarders, was average in every way except perhaps that he listened more than he talked. None of this suggested a man who would, within 3 months, become a repository of unbearable knowledge. The company records show that Grayson was not the first choice for the position. Another surveyor, Martin Kepler, had been assigned but fell ill with pneumonia in mid-August. Grayson was selected as replacement on August 22nd, 10 days before departure. It was considered routine reassignment. In the vast machinery of coincidence and chance that determines who goes where and when, this was the gear that turned. Martin Kepler recovered and returned to work in October. Arthur Grayson went to the mountains instead. The 7 men gathered in Missoula on September 1st, 1902. They purchased final supplies, checked equipment, confirmed the route. The outfitter who sold them provisions later testified that they seemed well prepared, in good spirits, no tension among them that I could observe. They stayed that night at the Missoula Hotel. The desk clerk remembered Pritchard and Bergstrom reviewing maps in the lobby, Whitmore writing letters, the others playing cards. "Normal as could be," he said. "Men before a job." They left at dawn on September 2nd. 11 people saw them depart: the hotel staff, the hostler who brought their pack horses, early risers on their way to work. The last person to speak with any of them was a woman named Rose Kimball, who ran a bakery on Higgins Avenue. She sold them bread for the trail and later recalled that the young one, Whitmore, had seemed excited, like he was going somewhere grand. The trail they took was well established for the first 12 miles, following Rattlesnake Creek into the high country. After that, they would be navigating by map and compass, establishing their own route through territory that was technically surveyed, but largely untraveled. Their stated objective was to reach a series of high valleys suspected of containing copper deposits, map the claims, and collect samples. Expected duration: 19 days. A trapper named Alvin Kessler saw them on September 4th at the last established camp before the high passes. He was coming down as they were going up. In his statement to Marshal Dalton, he said, "They were making good time. Animals were sound. Men looked strong." Bergstrom asked me about weather signs. I told him the high country had been stable all month, but to watch for early snow. He thanked me. That was all. That was the last independent sighting of the 7 men together. What remains from before the event is a collection of ordinary details: letters written, conversations remembered, supplies purchased, route planned, men doing work they had done before, in mountains that had been crossed before, with equipment that was tested and reliable. There was no omen, no premonition. No sense that these particular men at this particular time were headed toward anything other than 3 weeks of hard but routine labor. The only anomaly, if it can be called that, appears in the recovered notebooks from base camp. Thomas Chen's geological diary contains entries dated September 8th through September 12th. Descriptions of rock formations, measurements, sketches. On September 13th, the entry is brief. Weather holding. Pritchard and Bergstrom scouting up a valley. Good exposure here. Then, in smaller letters at the bottom of the page, A. Grayson observed something unusual. Asked him to clarify. He said he was mistaken. Nothing more specific. No description of what Grayson thought he saw. No coordinates. No follow-up. The next entry is dated September 14th and returns to routine geological observations. It may mean nothing. Field notebooks are full of abandoned observations, things that seem significant in the moment and prove irrelevant. But it is there, a small crack in the record. And through that crack, one can imagine a conversation. Chen asking Grayson what he had seen. Grayson hesitating, deciding it was nothing, or deciding not to say. Already, perhaps, learning the vocabulary of silence. Reconstructing the last confirmed moment is an act of triangulation, working backward from fragments and silence. The base camp was located at approximately 6,400 feet elevation in a meadow beside a tributary of Rattlesnake Creek. The search parties found it on October 17th, 15 days after Anaconda reported the crew overdue. The foreman of the first search party, a man named Jacob Howell, provided detailed testimony about what they discovered. The camp was intact, 2 large tents, still standing. Supply crates organized and accounted for, with the exception of field rations that would have been carried on daily surveys. Cooking equipment clean and stored. Bedrolls laid out as if the men had intended to return. A fire pit with cold ashes. The pack animals were gone. Later found by a second search party grazing in a valley 6 miles east, still wearing their hobbles. What the camp contained was evidence of ordinary routine. What it lacked was evidence of departure. Thomas Chen's notebooks were stacked in a wooden crate, protected from weather. The last dated entry was September 14th. Carl Bergstrom's transit and surveying equipment were stored properly in their cases. Medical supplies were inventoried and mostly present. Daniel Hopewell's cook kit was clean. Personal effects remained. William Pritchard's letters from his wife, James Whitmore's unfinished letter to his fiancée, spare clothing, tobacco, books. The only items clearly missing were those the men would have carried. Field notebooks they would have been using, weapons, 3 rifles that had been signed out, canteens, and the day packs used for surveys, and the men themselves. The search parties worked outward from base camp in expanding circles, following the terrain the survey crew would have been mapping. They found markers, survey stakes driven into the ground, cairns built at sightlines, the physical evidence of work in progress. The highest marker was located at 7,800 feet on a ridge overlooking a valley the maps called Lost Horse Basin. It was dated September 18th, carved into the wooden stake in Carl Bergstrom's methodical hand. 6 days before the crew was due to return to Missoula. 12 days before anyone began looking for them. The search parties found no evidence of disaster, no avalanche debris, no rockfall, no signs of animal attack, no indication of fire or flood. They found no bodies. They found no blood. They found, in Jacob Howell's words, nothing to explain absence. One detail troubled the searchers. A second camp, discovered a quarter-mile from the main site, higher up the slope. It consisted of a single small tent, hastily erected, and signs that one person had slept there for multiple nights. The ground showed evidence of 1 bedroll, 1 fire pit, refuse from meals for one. No indication of who or why. Marshal Dalton's inquiry spent considerable time on this secondary camp. When shown a photograph of the site, Arthur Grayson was asked if he recognized it. He did not respond. When asked if he had slept there, he did not respond. When asked why a man would separate himself from the main camp, he did not respond. The search parties continued through late October and into early November, hampered by snow. They covered over 200 square miles of high country. They found nothing more. And then Arthur Grayson walked out. He appeared at a ranger station at the western edge of the wilderness on November 9th. The ranger on duty, Charles Matson, filed a report that has become one of the few official documents describing Grayson's condition upon emergence. Man appeared at station approx 3 p.m. Did not knock, stood at door until I noticed him. Provided name when asked. Asked if he was Arthur Grayson from the missing survey crew. He confirmed. Asked where the others were. He did not answer. Asked if they were alive. He did not answer. Asked if he needed medical attention. He shook his head no. Asked if he needed food. He accepted. Fed him. He ate slowly. Asked again about the crew. He said nothing. Asked if he wished to make a statement. He said no. Asked if I should contact authorities. He nodded yes. Sent word to Missoula. Man waited in the station without speaking. Slept on floor that night. In morning still would not speak of events. Seemed to be of sound mind, walked without assistance, showed signs of weight loss and exposure but no acute injury. Could not compel him to speak. The ranger's wife, interviewed years later, remembered watching Grayson through the window of their quarters. He sat very still, she said, like a man who had learned stillness as a survival skill and forgotten how to move naturally. Company representatives met him the following day and escorted him to Missoula. During the journey, they asked him to guide them back to where he had been, where the others might be. He refused. When they asked why he refused, he said only, "It would not help." When pressed on what he meant, whether the others were dead, whether there was danger, whether he feared something, he returned to silence. The families demanded that he lead a search party. The company considered forcing the issue legally. A lawyer consulted on the matter advised that compelling testimony about events he had witnessed might be possible, but compelling him to return to a location against his will presented difficulties. In the end, Arthur Grayson was asked one more time, in the presence of Marshal Dalton and representatives from each family, to guide searches to wherever the separation had occurred. According to the transcript, he responded with his longest recorded statement on the matter. "I cannot help you find them. I cannot help you understand. I am sorry. I will carry this, but I will not share it." When Margaret Pritchard asked him if her husband had suffered, he closed his eyes and did not answer. When Thomas Chen's brother, visiting from San Francisco, asked if there had been an accident, Grayson did not answer. When Carl Bergstrom's sister asked if he had tried to save them, his hands began to shake, but he did not answer. The families left that meeting with nothing but the sight of a man who had knowledge and would not give it, who had been there and would not take them back, who had survived and would not explain how. Some of the search parties continued into the winter, convinced that Grayson's refusal meant the men might still be alive, trapped or injured somewhere he would not reveal. The snow drove them back. In spring, new searches were organized, using the survey markers and base camp as starting points, expanding in directions Grayson might have traveled. They found nothing. The Rattlesnake Wilderness kept what it had taken, and the silence around what had happened in those weeks between September 18th, the date on the last survey marker, and November 9th, the date Arthur Grayson walked out alone, became its own kind of topography. A negative space that no amount of searching could fill. One document from the inquiry stands out. A letter from the sister of Samuel Morrison, written to Marshal Dalton after the investigation was closed. She had traveled to Helena in March 1903 and had attempted to speak with Grayson directly. She wrote, "I told him I did not need to know what happened. I only needed to know if my brother was gone, truly gone, so I could stop imagining him alive somewhere and suffering. I said he did not need to give me details, only confirmation. He looked at me and I saw something in his face that might have been compassion or might have been anguish. I could not tell which." He said, and these are his exact words because I wrote them down immediately after, "He is not suffering." Then he stood and left the room. It was the only answer he gave anyone, as far as I know. I have tried to find comfort in it. He is not suffering. Not, he is dead. Not, he is gone. But, he is not suffering. A careful parsing of tense and implication, an answer that gave the barest minimum while protecting something larger. The question that haunted investigators was whether Grayson's silence represented suppressed trauma or deliberate choice, whether he could not speak or would not speak. Every encounter suggested the latter. He was examined by 2 physicians who found him mentally competent. He was observed by dozens of people in various contexts. All described a man in full control of his faculties, making a conscious decision to withhold information. But choice implies reason. And what reason could justify condemning families to permanent not knowing? The assumption, then and later, was that the truth was too terrible for him to speak, that it would expose something shameful about himself or traumatize the families further. Self-protection or misguided mercy. No one seems to have considered a third option. That silence was the last promise he could keep. The years following the disappearance transformed Arthur Grayson from a person into a symbol of guilt, of mystery, of the maddening human capacity to witness and not tell. He continued working at the assay office in Helena. His employers, questioned by journalists in 1904, said he was punctual, accurate, and never spoke of personal matters. He weighed ore samples, recorded mineral content, filed reports, work that required no collaboration, no conversation beyond the necessary. He was good at it. The city arranged itself around him carefully. People learned which streets he walked, which shops he frequented, which pew he sat in at St. Paul's Methodist on the Sundays he attended. Those who wanted to avoid him, and there were many, could do so. Those who wanted to confront him found that confrontation yielded nothing but their own exhausted anger. In 1904, a reporter from the Anaconda Standard tracked him for a week, documenting his routine in a piece titled, "The Man Who Won't Tell." The article describes Grayson's life in numbing detail. Wakes at 6, walks to work by 7, returns home at 6:30, eats at a nearby boarding house, reads in his room until 9, sleeps. He moves through the world, the reporter wrote, like a man trying to take up as little space as possible, as if existence itself is something he must apologize for. The piece included interviews with neighbors and co-workers, all variations on a theme. He keeps to himself. He is polite but does not invite conversation. He seems to be carrying something heavy. When asked directly about the expedition, about his silence, the reporter wrote, "He looked at me with the expression of a man watching something drowning from a shore, knowing that to jump in would only add another body to the count." Public opinion remained divided. The Helena Independent published letters to the editor for years, some defending Grayson's right to privacy, others demanding legal action to compel testimony. A lawyer named Morris Greenbaum wrote in 1905, "We have no legal framework to force a man to speak of what he has witnessed, only what he has done. Mr. Grayson has been accused of no crime. His silence, while morally troubling, is not illegal. We are left only to speculate, and speculation is not justice. But speculation was all anyone had, and it flourished in the absence of fact. Some theories were procedural. There had been an accident, perhaps a fall or drowning, and Grayson blamed himself for failing to prevent it. Others were darker. He had caused their deaths, either through negligence or intent, and silence was self-preservation. A third category suggested shared culpability. The men had done something together, claimed jumping perhaps or theft, and had died in the commission of it, leaving Grayson to protect their reputations. The most elaborate theory came from a professor of geology at the University of Montana, published in a mining journal in 1906. He proposed that the men had discovered something valuable, a significant copper deposit, and had agreed to keep it secret until they could file claims themselves. They had scattered to different locations to begin preliminary extraction, planning to regroup, but had been killed by claim jumpers or succumbed individually to accidents, leaving Grayson alive but bound by their agreement to secrecy. The theory was thorough, plausible, and completely unprovable. Like all the others, it said more about what people needed to believe than about what had actually happened. The families, meanwhile, lived in permanent suspension. Margaret Pritchard never remarried. She raised her 3 children alone, working as a seamstress. Her daughter, interviewed in 1948 for an oral history project, remembered, Mother kept father's letters in a box under her bed. Sometimes I would find her reading them, and she would look up at me with this expression, not sad exactly, but distant, like she was trying to remember something just out of reach. She never spoke badly of Mr. Grayson. She said once that she thought he was suffering more than we were, which seemed impossible to me then. Caroline Dennison, James Whitmore's fiancée, married someone else in 1905. She kept her relationship with Whitmore private for the rest of her life. Her husband knew about it, but they did not speak of it. When she died in 1956, her children found the unfinished letter Whitmore had been writing when he departed for the survey, the one that had been returned with his effects. She had kept it for 54 years. Thomas Chen's family in San Francisco hired a private investigator in 1903 to look into the disappearance. The investigator's report, preserved in the Chen family papers at the California Historical Society, concluded, "Arthur Grayson is either the most disciplined man I have encountered or the most haunted. I observed him for 2 weeks. He betrays no nervousness, no guilty glances, no behavior that would suggest he is hiding from detection. But neither does he seem at peace. He lives like a man under a vow." The investigator made one attempt to speak with Grayson directly, approaching him on the street. "I identified myself and my purpose," the report states. "I told him the family did not seek to punish or expose him, only to know what had become of their son. He stopped walking but did not face me. After a long silence, he said, 'Tell them he was a good man. Tell them his work was meticulous. Tell them he died doing what he believed was right.' Then he walked away. When I called after him to ask what he meant by what he believed was right, he did not turn. It was one of the few times Grayson spoke of any of them directly, and even then he had given only character assessment, not circumstance. The pressure to speak came not just from families, but from institutions. The mining company, facing scrutiny over safety practices, wanted an official account that would close the matter. The state government, concerned about unsolved disappearances in federal territory, wanted resolution. Even the church intervened. A pastor from St. Paul's Methodist attempted to counsel Grayson in 1905, believing perhaps that confession would ease his soul. The pastor, Reverend Thomas Carver, wrote about the encounter in his private journal, excerpts of which were published after his death in 1931. "I told him that God forgives what men condemn, that truth is a balm even when it burns. He listened respectfully. When I finished, he said, 'I appreciate your concern, Reverend, but my silence is not about forgiveness. Some knowledge is a burden that should not be shared.' I asked him to clarify. He said, 'If I told you what I know, you would carry it too, and you would wish you did not.' I realized then I was not speaking with a man seeking absolution, but a man who had already made peace with damnation, if that was the price of keeping others from it. The families tried everything: letters, pleading, legal threats which went nowhere, offers of money which were refused. Margaret Pritchard wrote to him annually on the anniversary of her husband's disappearance, 17 letters in total from 1903 to 1919, each asking the same question in different words. What happened to William? Grayson never responded. Claire, his sister, remained his only regular contact. She never asked him about the expedition after that first attempt. Instead, she visited, brought news, sat with him. In her diary she wrote, "I do not know what Arthur saw or did, and I have stopped trying to imagine it. What I know is that he is here, and he is my brother, and whatever he carries has bent him but not broken him. If silence is how he survives, then I will sit with him in it." On one occasion in 1908 she almost asked. They were walking near the Capitol, and she saw him pause at the sight of a young boy playing with his father. She saw something move across his face, grief or longing or recognition. She started to say his name, to ask if he ever thought of telling someone, anyone, just to share the weight. He turned to her before she could speak and said quietly, "Don't." She didn't. The only person who seemed to penetrate Grayson's isolation was a physician named Dr. Edward Hollis, who treated him for pneumonia in 1911. During the illness, Grayson was delirious with fever, and Dr. Hollis reported that he spoke fragments of sentences, names, phrases that made no coherent sense. The doctor's notes, later subpoenaed by a lawyer representing one of the families, record only, patient exhibited signs of extreme distress while fevered, called out several names, Pritchard, Chen, others, repeatedly said, "I promised." When consciousness returned, patient refused to discuss statements made during delirium. Asked if he recalled what he said, he stated, "I remember." Asked if he wished to clarify, he declined. Even in unconsciousness, Grayson had given nothing actionable, only fragments, only noise. By 1915, the public attention had faded. The disappearance became historical, a story told in Helena saloons and printed in regional history books as one of Montana's unsolved mysteries. Arthur Grayson became a footnote, then a name, then a ghost story parents told children, the man who walked out of the mountains and never spoke. But he was still living, still walking to work each morning, still existing in that careful, narrow way. In 1918, the influenza epidemic reached Helena. Grayson fell ill in October. Dr. Hollis treated him again and noted that Grayson seemed almost resigned to dying, made no effort to fight the illness. He recovered, but slowly. Claire visited him during his convalescence and wrote, "He said something today that troubled me. He said, 'I thought this might be the end of it.' I asked what he meant. He said, 'The remembering.' I told him memory is part of living, and he said, 'Not all memories should be lived with. Some should have died with the ones who shared them.' I didn't know what to say to that. The families, those who remained, eventually stopped searching for answers, not because they found peace, but because time and absence taught them that some questions outlive the people who ask them. Margaret Pritchard died in 1924. Her children found, among her effects, a letter she had written but never sent. It was addressed to Arthur Grayson and dated 1923. It read, "I have spent 21 years trying to understand why you will not speak. I have imagined every possible reason. I have hated you, pitied you, forgiven you, condemned you, and finally accepted that I will never know. What I want to say is this. I believe my husband is dead. I believe you know how he died. I believe you have chosen not to tell me, and I believe you had a reason. I do not know if that reason is good or bad, selfish or merciful, but I am tired. I am so tired of not knowing and of knowing that someone knows. If there is any kindness left in you, please just tell me this. Did William think of us at the end? That is all I need. Not how, not why, just whether we were in his thoughts. You owe me nothing, but I'm asking anyway." She never sent it. Perhaps she knew it would not be answered. Arthur Grayson lived through the years carrying the weight of their questions, their grief, their anger, and their eventual resignation. And through it all, he kept his silence. Not once did he waver. Not once did he explain. He remained, as Reverend Carver had written, a man who had made peace with being the keeper of something that must not be kept and cannot be released. Arthur James Grayson died on March 3, 1929, at the age of 56. The cause was heart failure, sudden and complete. He was found in his room above the tailor's shop by the landlord, who had come to collect rent. There was no note. There were no papers explaining what had happened in the Rattlesnake Wilderness 27 years earlier. No deathbed confession, no sealed envelope marked, "To be opened after my death." His funeral was attended by 14 people, his sister Claire, her family, a few co-workers from the assay office, Dr. Hollis, and 3 people who came out of curiosity or unfinished business. No one recorded who they were. The service was brief. Reverend Carver, retired by then, spoke about the mercy of rest and the burden of living. At the graveside, Claire placed a small cloth bundle in the coffin before it was closed. A witness said it looked like stones wrapped in canvas, the kind a geologist might collect. No one asked her about it. He was buried in Forest Vale Cemetery in Helena, under a simple marker that gave only his name and dates. For years, people would occasionally visit the grave, family members of the lost men, curious historians, people who had read about the case. Some left flowers, some left notes, asking one more time for an answer that would never come. In 1932, the Anaconda Standard ran a retrospective on the disappearance, marking the 30th anniversary. The piece included interviews with surviving family members and mining historians. One section read, "The question of what Arthur Grayson knew died with him, and perhaps that was always inevitable. We are left with theories but no truth, with silence where there should be testimony. Some have called him a coward, others have called him a victim. This writer believes he was a man who made a choice, for reasons we will never understand, to carry something alone rather than distribute its weight. Whether that choice was noble or selfish, merciful or cruel, we cannot say. We can only observe that he bore it until the end. The historical record, such as it is, ends there. The official files were closed decades ago. The search areas have been resurveyed, logged, and in some cases developed. The Rattlesnake Wilderness, now partly protected as a national recreation area, has given up no further evidence. Hikers occasionally report finding old survey stakes, rusted equipment, the detritus of a century of human passage through the high country. None of it connects definitively to the 1902 expedition. The families have passed. Their descendants, if they remember the story at all, remember it as genealogical curiosity. Great-grandfather who disappeared in Montana, mystery never solved. But the silence persists, and in that silence, patterns emerge if one looks carefully enough. Consider the chronology. 7 men enter the wilderness on September 2nd. By September 18th, they are still working, leaving survey markers. Sometime between September 18th and November 9th, a span of 52 days, 6 men disappear and 1 man survives. That survivor walks out alone, refuses to guide searchers back, refuses to describe what happened, but also shows no signs of physical trauma consistent with violence or extreme survival conditions. Consider the secondary camp, 1 person separated from the main group living apart. The search parties assumed this was Grayson, but he never confirmed it. If it was him, what would cause a man to separate himself from his companions? Illness, conflict, or perhaps something else? A decision made by the group, a role assigned? Consider Grayson's few statements, parsed for meaning. It would not help. Not, I don't know where they are. But knowing would not help. He is not suffering. Not, he died. But his suffering ended. I will carry this, but I will not share it. Not, I cannot remember. But I remember and choose not to tell. I promised. Said in delirium, perhaps the truest thing he ever revealed. Each phrase suggests intentionality. Each phrase suggests knowledge, not absence of knowledge. And each phrase suggests protection of the families, of the dead, of something. In 1967, a graduate student in history at Montana State University, working on a thesis about mining disasters, stumbled upon the Grayson case while reviewing Anaconda Company records. His thesis, Industrial Silence, Corporate and Personal Non-Disclosure in Montana Mining, 1880-1920, included a chapter on the 1902 disappearance. He interviewed Claire Grayson's daughter, Arthur's niece, who was 71 at the time. She had been 17 when her uncle died. She remembered him as kind but absent, like he was always listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. The graduate student asked her if her mother had ever hinted at what Arthur might have known. The niece said, "Once, near the end of her life, I asked Mother directly. I was old enough by then that I thought she might tell me. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, 'Arthur told me once that some men face choices where every option is terrible, and the only thing left is choosing which terrible thing you can live with. He chose silence because the alternatives would have destroyed people who were already destroyed.' I asked her what she thought he meant. She said she didn't know, but that Arthur was not a cruel man, and if he thought silence was mercy, then maybe it was. Maybe it was. Or maybe it wasn't mercy at all, but obligation. A promise made in extremity and kept at all costs." The thesis student noted one final detail. Among Arthur Grayson's effects, sold at a state sale after his death, was a small leather journal. The pages were blank except for 7 names written on the first page, carefully inscribed: William Pritchard, Thomas Chen, Carl Bergstrom, Samuel Morrison, James Whitmore, Daniel Hopewell, Arthur Grayson, his own name among the others, not separated, not marked as different. 7 men went into the mountains, 1 walked out. But perhaps, in whatever happened there, all 7 made a choice, and Arthur Grayson was simply the one tasked with living with it. Perhaps the silence was not his alone, but theirs, collectively. A last agreement made when all other agreements had failed, when the only thing left was deciding what the world should and should not know. Perhaps he walked out carrying not just his own secret, but theirs as well. We do not know. We cannot know. The historian's task is reconstruction, but some things resist reconstruction. Some silences are structural, load-bearing. Remove them, and the entire edifice of what remains collapses into speculation and invention. What we have is this: Arthur Grayson witnessed something in the Rattlesnake Wilderness in the autumn of 1902. That something resulted in 6 deaths and 1 survival. He chose, consistently and absolutely, not to reveal what he had witnessed. That choice cost him public reputation, private peace, and any chance of absolution from the families of the dead. He paid that cost for 27 years. If his silence was guilt, it was guilt he could have confessed and been done with. If it was trauma, it was trauma he could have sought help for. If it was cowardice, it was the most sustained and disciplined cowardice ever documented. But if it was protection, if it was a promise kept, a burden accepted, a truth withheld, not because it would harm him but because it would harm others, then Arthur Grayson died exactly as he lived, faithful to something larger than himself. The truth of what happened in those mountains is gone. It left when he died, if it was ever his to give it all. What remains is the fact of the silence itself, and the question which each reader must answer for themselves. What could be so terrible, so unbearable, so destructive that silence, permanent, absolute, isolating silence, would be the more merciful choice? What truth could break families more than absence already had? What knowledge could condemn the dead more than disappearance already did? What happened to 6 men that the 7th would spend the rest of his life protecting them from the knowing of it? We will never have the answer, but we have the silence. And in that silence, if we listen carefully enough, we might hear not evasion, but devotion, not cowardice, but terrible, unbearable loyalty. Arthur Grayson was many things in his 56 years: brother, worker, surveyor, survivor. But perhaps what he was most of all was a keeper of faith with the dead, a guardian at a boundary no one should cross. He stood at that boundary for 27 years and would not let anyone through, not even himself. The file remains open in the Montana Historical Society archives, case number 1902A47. Anyone can request it. The documents are public: the testimonies, the search reports, the letters, the newspaper clippings, the photographs of the mountains and the men and the lone survivor who would not speak. It is all there, everything except the answer, and that, perhaps, is exactly what Arthur Grayson intended: to give us everything but the one thing, and in that withholding, to protect something we were never meant to carry. 7 men went into the mountains. 1 came back, and he kept their secret until it became his grave. That is all we know. That is all we will ever know. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough.